We are live, everybody.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this important discussion on gender equality with Professor Linda Scott, author of the groundbreaking book, The Double X Economy. I'm Ann Hesse, and I lead the Democrats Abroad Global Women's Caucus. I'm joined in hosting our discussion today by Angela Fobbs, DA Black Caucus Chair, Pat White and Carol Moore, who chair our new Women's Economic Wellbeing and Leadership Initiative, and Katie Brand, who chairs the DA France Women's Caucus. Please note that we'll be gathering questions for Dr. Scott from the Zoom Q&A box and on Facebook, where we're streaming live now. So you're welcome to type in your questions as we go along. This event has been organized by Pat and Carol as part of their new initiative. So we'll start off with Pat giving a brief overview of the goals of this exciting new project. Pat?
Thank you, Ann, and thank you all for joining our conversation today. We're excited to announce the launch of the Women's Economic Wellbeing and Leadership Initiative in conjunction with Democrats Abroad's State of American Women Project. You heard the words economic and leadership in the title, but it could be making families whole, improving women's lives. I say that because women are the primary breadwinners in 50% of US households. The census tells us that, and in families of color, the number is even higher. Yet our skills, voices, and contributions are often undervalued and overlooked. The Women's Economic Wellbeing and Leadership Initiative links the concerns Democrats focus on, from taxation to education to health, to show us that there's an economic component and a leadership component that ties back to the opportunities of women. This initiative looked at the overlap in our 2020 platform to help bring us to a way of work that connects the dots between issues for those who are Democrats abroad, who vote Democratic, and who work to convince others to do so. I, like many of you, know so many women who are struggling from an economic standpoint. And like me, you have walked into many meetings where there's only one or two women in the room. But in those rooms, important decisions about our lives are being made, and we're missing. We are too often not at the table on issues that matter to us, our family, and our community. We are in a watershed moment to achieve gains in women's leadership and economic conditions across a spectrum of issues through our actions as concerned citizens and voters. The mission of the initiative is simple: to advocate for women's economic well-being and leadership to achieve and possibly exceed the policy goals for American women documented and adopted in the 2020 Democrats Abroad platform. With the platform as our blueprint for action, we want to educate members on the connectiveness of issues across the platform that limits women's opportunities, to engage members in policy activism that lead to changes in women's status, particularly for women of color, and to support elected and appointed officials and those seeking office to achieve outcomes for women. I hope you share our excitement about this effort and the ways in which it can strengthen all that we do. Please visit our webpage and volunteer your time and skills to the effort. I want to thank Dr. Scott for joining us today to jumpstart the initiative. I will now turn to Carol Moore, Democrat Abroad member from the UK and co-partner of the initiative, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Pat. It is a real pleasure to welcome everyone here to hear Professor Scott. She will describe her extensive research into the barriers to women's equality and has a call to action to end the tragedy of humanity's treatment of women. Those are strong words, but they are what she is going to document and tell us about. She sees this as one of the darkest parts of our history, and it continues today. Linda and I actually are contemporaries, as we only recently learned. She was raised in Texas, and I was raised in New York City. I first hit quotas in 1970 when applying to law school. 3 years later, I found many closed doors when I applied to law firms. But by then, the federal government was an equal opportunity employer. And so I did get a job and started my career in the US Securities and Exchange Commission. My second employer, Chase Manhattan Bank, had been sued a couple of years before I joined for sex discrimination. I was hired into the prestigious corporate banking division in London, thanks to the efforts of the other women before me. I thought the barriers were coming down. This was the era Betty Friedan had written The Feminine Mystique. Roe v. Wade had been won in 1973. But I underestimated the patriarchy. Meanwhile, Linda earned a PhD degree in communications at the University of Texas, and she began her academic career in the States. In 2006, Linda moved to Oxford's Said Business School. And in 2010, she was appointed the DP chair for entrepreneurship and innovation. She is now an emeritus professor, but she has a sideline in gender equality. Linda has traveled around the world to some of the poorest countries in Africa and Asia to identify the real barriers women face and tackle them. She has led teams to keep young girls in high school in Ghana and to help women farmers in Kenya get their produce to the more lucrative market when they have been excluded by male communes or organizations. In the US, she was asked to look at MBA programs where women students and a very small number of women faculty were not thriving. In a 2014 article, she made the strong case that sex discrimination existed, often driven by the dominant older male finance faculty. This culture rested on prejudice. They were against women based on flawed stereotypes, not empirical evidence. I first met Linda when she spoke just this February at an online LSE lecture. It was shortly after Pat and I had connected. I didn't know what the double X economy was, but I certainly wanted to know more about the epic potential of empowering women. Linda's research documents the global extent of women's inequality and the many barriers that remain, particularly after the pandemic. Yet Linda argues for an optimistic future, that the equal economic treatment of women would end some of the world's costliest evils while building prosperity for all. Thank you, Linda, for joining us today, not only to go over the problems, but also to highlight the campaign for women's economic empowerment. We need to be advocates with this Democratic administration to continue putting significant resources into bringing gender equality at home and with targeted programs abroad. Over to you, Linda.
Thank you, Carol, and thanks to everyone, because I'm really, really honored and excited to be able to talk to this group since I am an American and I am living back in the United States now, and have been watching, as have most people, very closely the politics of the last few years. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to speak to some of the issues that I'm seeing. As Carol mentioned, I've just published a book called The Double X Economy, and I want to explain first that the double X economy is a term that I coined to describe the economy of women, which is an economy that is defined by constraints on economic participation that are the same all over the world and therefore produce the same pattern of inequality among females in every country. This is including the developed countries, and that means the USA, and these are no exception. The similarities across cultures as far as the way women are excluded and rendered unequal are evident in the impact of the pandemic. All over the world, we've seen women hurt more than men, and it's largely because they are clustered in particular industries and because they were essentially forced to go back into the home in greater numbers and in greater inequality than the men. The double X economy is something that goes well beyond employment. We're accustomed to thinking of women's disadvantaging us in employment. However, this is something that is 360 degrees. It's a full economy and it's full discrimination. And therefore, the impact reaches access to finance and markets, for example, includes barriers to education and training, and is held together by things like childcare needs and the threat of violence. My purpose today is, although I will talk about the global implications, I'm going to try to focus on the implications for American policy, both domestic and abroad. The interests of women have suffered a great deal under the Trump administration and under Republican leadership generally since the 1990s. So this is where I want to emphasize my remarks in hopes of being able to give you some ideas about where the campaign could look going forward. Let me say that I'm going to talk about some economic aspects here in a way that will be fairly high level. And if anyone wants to look into it, everything I'm going to talk about today is in the book. As far as the economic aspects, they're all fully documented there. And I have made every attempt to explain them in a way that a lay reader will not only find comprehensible, but fairly enjoyable to read. And I'm told that I did this fairly successfully. So if you want to see more about anything I said today, you can look there. In the first instance, it's a little bit mysterious why it is that women's economic engagement gets so little attention, even now that we fully understand the importance of including women on an equal basis to economic growth. And I'm going to show you a graph here. And Angela, if I could have that very first graph, thank you, that demonstrates in broad terms what the relationship is. What you see here is a graph that has along the horizontal axis women's economic empowerment expressed in an index constructed by the Economist Intelligence Unit. And across the vertical axis, you have GDP per capita, and this data is plotted for 102 countries. That's all of the countries for which both sets of data are available. As you can see, there is a strong movement of all these data points upward and to the right. And what that indicates is that there's a positive relationship between these two things. In other words, the more women are economically empowered in the world, the greater the GDP per capita of that country. So we can set that one aside now, Angela. And what we found over time, this causality was, or this relationship was discovered about 10 years ago, but in the meantime, there's been quite a lot more evidence of various sorts that underscore that and show that actually the relationship between these two things is causal. So that in other words, it's not the case that the rich countries were able to, they had the luxury of freeing their women, it's that freeing their women made them rich. And it is crucial to the economic health of all countries to keep women included and to do so on an equal basis. It's perhaps a little mysterious because people don't immediately understand why the women would have such an important impact. But if you think about it, in most of the countries of the world, in virtually every country in the world, virtually all the men are 100% employed or engaged in the economy on a full-time basis. What that means then is that you can't really look to them for growth because they're more or less maxed out. On the other hand, women tend to be underutilized or completely untapped, so that when you bring them into the economy, their impact is additional. They do not, in the data show, take away income or employment for men, but because they generate growth, add opportunity for everybody. Essentially, the reason that this occurs is that the pattern that you just saw is that countries who are not including women are making poor use of their resources in both labor and enterprise. And so going forward in this discussion, I want to point out that economists and policymakers who are not paying attention to women's engagement in the economy are ignoring the elephant in the room. This is a very big phenomenon. It's a very important and well-demonstrated phenomenon. It's also important to recognize that the reverse of this logic is also true, and that is where women are excluded the most. The countries are poorest, and indeed they are also the most conflict-ridden, the hungriest, and the most plagued by disease. I've recently written a paper for USAID that documents, in fact, that the relationship between women's economic exclusion is causal to poverty, hunger, and conflict. This is an important position for them to be taking, so I have been asking the Women's Caucus if they will help me distribute this paper, and they've kindly agreed to help me do that. This paper, in conjunction with these growth figures that I've just shown you, show that, that in fact, gender inequality in the economy is a structural phenomenon. And in fact, further research that I document in the book shows that it's that these structural factors are based in longstanding historical restrictions on female economic liberty. And I found that perhaps the most intelligible and dramatic example of how this happened is the global pattern of land holding by gender. So if I could see that next slide up here for everybody. This is information provided by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. Basically what I've done here is to graph 106 countries. They're both developed and developing countries. And I have mapped on the percent of individuals who hold land in those countries, showing the males with black dots and the females with red dots. Well, you can see immediately that the men and the women are vastly different in their ability to hold land. And that this pattern is so dramatic, there is no way that it could be said to be random in any way. And because holding land has been throughout human history, or at least since the invention of agriculture, the main way that wealth is both generated and stored, and it has been an important base for power, it makes no sense that women would have chosen to be landless. So what we need to do then is to find out what it is that has caused this. And in the book, I document that it's basically what I call the Downton Abbey principle. And that is that through cultures throughout time and around the world, women have been forbidden, usually legally, but also often just as effectively by custom, from holding land. And that this is something that has had such a profound effect on the holding of wealth among humans that it is still visible today. Today, what we see then is that about 80%, a little more than 80% of the world's arable land is owned and controlled by men. And what that has rolled up to over time is that approximately the same percentage of the world's capital is also owned and controlled by men. So that you can see that this long-standing exclusion has produced a structural inequity that would dog everything from retirement accounts to enterprise, the basis for investment in enterprise for women. So we can lose that one now. Thank you. What happens too then is that the inability for women to own land, in particular in developing countries, has all kinds of implications in terms of human suffering, as Carol mentioned. It has implications for the amount of violence, domestic violence in particular, as well as hunger. And I can tell you a little more about that if someone wants to ask a question about it. But again, it is covered in the book. Eventually, exclusions like this show their footprint also in assumptions, cultural assumptions that underlie unequal treatment of women in the economies. So, for example, that women should not want or have wealth or money, or that they are not good at money, or that they are bad at everything economic, or that women should stay home and withdraw from the economy. And an example of this, for example, is the pervasiveness of paying women unequally for the same work, or for not paying them at all for the work that they do that contributes to that economy, whether it's household labor or it's farm work. Now, there is a myth out there, a meme out there that says that the gender pay gap, for example, is a fiction. And one of the things that I do in the book is to explain that this is absolutely not true, that the gender pay gap is very real. It can be measured in multiple ways, and is measured in multiple ways around the world. And all of that data shows that there is a gender pay gap. It is unavoidable. And the way that people get around or try to argue that it doesn't exist is by controlling for variables that actually enforce or represent inequality. And an example is, the best way to explain it is by an analogy. And that is that, for example, African-American males in the United States are generally paid less than men, white men as a group. If, however, you go in, let's imagine a group of economists says, well, if we went in and we controlled for variables like lives in a disadvantaged zip code, or has spent X number of days in unemployment, or has been arrested at any time, you would probably be able to control for those variables and come out with the conclusion that Black men are paid equal to white men. And if you then went further and said, so there is no racism in America. If Black men would simply make the same choices that white men make, they would be equal. And we would all see that as plain out racism. We would not accept it. And in fact, we would question the kind of motive that would lie behind a study of that sort or an interpretation of that sort. And it is the same with all the studies that purport to show that the gender pay gap is not real. Now, if I can show you the next graph, it will demonstrate with a data set that is not manipulable in that way. And it's produced by the World Economic Forum. This is data for 132 countries in 2018. The red columns show a measurement called wage equality for similar work, which is taken from the top 100 employers in each country and basically answers the question, essentially, what is the normal percentage of pay that women get as compared to men in your country when they are doing the same or similar work? And as you can see from this graph, the red columns show that there is not a country in the entire world where it is customary to pay women and men the same. The black bar across the top shows where those columns would have to be if women were being paid the same as men. Not a single country makes it up there. So that's, I don't need that slide anymore. Thank you. That number for the United States in that graph is 80%. And unlike most countries, that is actually about equal to what the numbers are from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's very important, though, to go beyond just the fact that it's a 20% pay gap in the US, that there are pockets where the pay gap is larger, and that this may represent a political opportunity as well as an opportunity for intervention and advocacy. For example, in manufacturing, the gap between men and women's pay is 30% as opposed to 20%. And it has seemed to me all along that given the nature of politics in the US right now, that the Democrats are missing an opportunity to bring in a large number of voters who are women employed in manufacturing and who are probably, without their knowing, experiencing more discrimination than women in other jobs. Overall, it's important to understand that the progress against equal pay has flattened since the 1990s and has been particularly problematic since Justice John Roberts took over as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The Roberts Court does not just pose a threat to reproductive rights. They have already taken lethal steps toward counteracting women's employment rights. By particularly acting on the ability to enforce the existing equality laws. In particular, there have been two decisions by the Roberts Court since he took over. One is upholding forced arbitration contracts, and the other is declaring that women are not a class. The first one basically makes it legal for employers to force their employees to sign contracts in which they give up their right to sue and give up their right to be part of a class action suit. The second one is actually the result of the Dukes versus Walmart decision in 2010, which most people think is Walmart winning that suit. That is not the case. It's that the court decided to throw the class action application of the complainants out. So that from the point of view of next step for the Democrats, what I would say is in an current issue of whether or not to pack the court, although I do tend to be rather conservative about wanting to make structural changes to the democratic institutions of the United States. If you are concerned about the interests of women in the economy, either in the near term or the long term, it's pretty clear that that court needs to be packed, in my view. It is interesting to me and should be to you, I think, that the United States has largely been ignoring the impact of the pandemic on women. And I find this personally appalling. It's politically stupid in my view, but it's economically insane. Women in the United States, if they were to decide to form their own nation, their economy would immediately be big enough to join the G7. In fact, they would be the second largest economy in the G7, just after the United States of men. So this is a very significant part of the economy. If I could have the next slide, please. And we can see this in a number of measures. First of all, it's usually surprising to most people that the percentage of GDP that is contributed by female workers is 40%. That is to say, roughly 40% of the American economy is coming from the female labor force. Before the pandemic, women had just reached for the first time 51% of the American labor force. That means that they had become the majority. They are not a trivial force. 85% of the consumer market in the United States is controlled by women. It's very important to understand that the economy runs on consumption as much as it runs on investment. And so this is a very important role that they play. As mentioned earlier, about half of American households now rely on women's income as a major breadwinner. It also is important to understand that mothers, as much as we tend in the US to still cling to a stereotype that mothers are at home, 41% of mothers are now primary breadwinners for their children. So if what we're concerned about is the well-being of children, we should be concerned about women's economic empowerment. Again, I already mentioned that the gender wage gap in manufacturing is 30%. There are places, many places in the economy where you can look at particularly disadvantaged groups, such as African-American women and Latinas, as suffering disproportionately. So we can lose that slide now. Thank you. It's important also to understand, I should also say, so assuming that it's trivial to be concerned with women's plight after the pandemic and leaving this on the table is really nuts, because you're basically saying that half your economy is not important to the recovery. And assuming also that there is no need to adjust for gender inequality in the approach is also just really bad policy. So for example, like I said, the doubleless economy represents not only employment, but also enterprise. All right, it's important to know that women-owned businesses in the American economy and all over the world are clustered in the very industries that were hit hardest by the pandemic, and that they tend to be essential services like daycare, and therefore will be important to the recovery and particularly to the renewed empowerment of women. However, that the business aid packages that were disseminated by the Congress have gone through the banks, which are known to be grossly discriminatory, and therefore they probably only got less than 5% of small business assistance, if that. They should have gotten grants because they have less access to capital of all kinds and because of their essential and crucial nature that they will have in terms of rebounding the economy. Going forward, childcare is something that I know the Biden administration is trying to address, and they should be. They should probably be doing more than they envision. It really cannot be emphasized enough, the importance of childcare to the women's economy. This is the single economic barrier that is most important for the whole women's economy all over the world. It affects even those who are not mothers because the attitudes and expectations for motherhood fuel discrimination across the entire economy, regardless of whether you are single or married, a mother or not. What we should have learned from the pandemic is that childcare needs to be looked at as a form of infrastructure, economic infrastructure. If half of your labor force is largely dependent on it, then it cannot be looked at as a handout or a luxury, as is common, particularly within the Congress. Before the pandemic, there was already a flattening in female labor force participation for the first time in 100 years in the United States, and the only developing country that was actually showing prospects of a decline, excuse me. It will probably get a lot worse after the pandemic, and that will be no surprise. to anyone listening to this. It's important to understand that much, if not most, of the growth of the American economy since the 1970s was generated by the entry of women into the workforce. And so economists were already worried about this decline before the pandemic. We're figuring out why that was happening, and the decline is attributable one way or another to the absence of childcare. It is hitting undereducated women the worst. It is probably having a major impact on Trump voters. So this is an issue that should appeal to all women and would be a political boon. It's important also to understand that it should not be evaluated as an expenditure that is merely a one-time expense, but as an investment that all countries that have looked into it see will pay for itself. It's really only bigotry and will for traditional thinking that holds this back. The evidence does not indicate that daycare, childcare is bad for kids, but quite the opposite, that it's good for them. It's especially important given that so many children depend on mother's income. And of course, this investment will contribute to growth the same as tax cuts would do. There is particular impact on the millennials going forward, which is something that we need to start looking at because the long-term economic impact of leaving the millennials out of the economy and leaving them with the disadvantages that they've inherited is going to be, in the long run, a very big deal. So one of the things I've suggested in the book and would love to see followed up is to look, for example, at the burden of student debt on the millennials, but particularly on the women. Female millennials are holding 2/3 of student debt, and that's because they have to go to school longer in order to get the same jobs that men get. They are nevertheless, even with equal qualifications, paid less than the men are. So what that means is they take out more debt, they pay it back with less money, and therefore they take longer to pay it back and they pay more interest. And so it's very important to start, I think, to start looking at this as a women's issue and to demand that all the student debt be retired. We need this to happen because the long-term impact of having the millennial generation unable to be able to, for example, farm households have children and to help with the retirement of their unprepared baby boomer parents is something we all need to have happen. We also need to see it because the effect of this economic disadvantage is having a very negative effect on the fertility rate in the United States. Many people don't understand, and I'm going to skip these next two graphs because I'm worried about time. Let me just say that it's a global phenomenon at this point that about more than 50% of the countries in the world are experiencing a fertility bust rather than a fertility growth. That generational measure is going to have implications for the economy, even in the short run, with low housing starts, low savings rates, and low consumer confidence. The US rate has been declining precipitously since 1960. It has dropped below the replacement rate, that is the necessary fertility rate to replace the population. It's going to have a sinister long-term impact because of its effect on human capital, not only on children, we won't have enough children, but on taking their mothers, who are the most educated segment of the American labor force, out of work. And therefore, this will cause a contraction in the labor force, which will stall or reduce growth and basically nuke the tax base. So this is something that really can't happen. And the United States is still high enough to turn it around, but they will not be able to do so unless they find the will to invest in childcare. If I may move on very briefly to foreign policy toward the end here, again, to point you to this USAID piece, it's really important to understand that gender inequality is now known to be a cause of poverty, and as such, it contributes to world hunger, to human trafficking, to civil conflict, and to population excesses. And the research is still being done, but it probably also contributes to climate change. It's already known in economic development that helping women in this way is the best way to fight poverty. It's the most effective, and yet only a tiny slice of international aid currently goes to women in the United States. We should not be ignoring them in policy, foreign policy, and so my hope is maybe this group can go help with that. Finally, let me just say that one of the really important emergent interests in issues in international policy is the cost of gender-based violence. Gender-based violence is what holds gender inequality in place everywhere. and it has a negative impact on suffering everywhere. Currently, there are various estimates floating around about what the cost of gender-based violence is, and I'm not going to go through all the ups and downs about how that's calculated, but I think we can say with confidence that it is more than 5% of global GDP. That's about 30 times what the world currently gives in international aid. It's really, really a large number. So it's very, very important to start making gender-based violence a feature in foreign and domestic policy, because it is hugely costly in addition to being a very bad thing from the point of view of human suffering. Attention to gender-based violence was quashed under Trump. I think most people who worked in the departments, such as in the State Department, can tell you that. He followed Vladimir Putin on this policy. This is something they're going to have to run fast to catch up now that he's gone. This is the kind of thing that I think we're going to find that as the Biden administration goes through what's left after the Trump administration are going to be hidden tragedies everywhere. There is really a lot to be gained by, as you can see, that because the positives of intervening on the behalf of the women's economy are so great, it's something that will benefit everybody, male, female, and certainly children, if we can only convince our leadership to get behind it. Thanks.
My goodness, thank you so much, Dr. Scott. My head is throbbing with all of this. Thank you so much. And well, as you can imagine, we have lots and lots of questions we'd like to ask you. But I would like to make sure that our economic initiative team start us off first. So Pat will pose our first question, followed by Carol. And then Angela and I will toss out some questions and get all the questions from our viewers on Facebook and Zoom to you after that. So Pat, what would you like to ask the professor?
Dr. Scott, thank you. You have given us much food for thought. The question that I want to pose to you is that much of what you have indicated calls for the concept of universal access, whether it's around childcare or other issues. Yet we know that universal access is not the starting point of US policy. And so it would be helpful for you to maybe help us think through how we get around that reality so that we can make the kinds of policy decisions that are essential for addressing many of the issues that you've raised today.
Sure. Let's start with universal childcare, for example. I think one of the ways, this is something that does, in my view, need to be a universal system, just like the public schools, for example. And it does require not only, I think, looking at the implications for the female labor force to say, well, this is economic infrastructure. We need this in order to maintain half of our labor force. Just like looking at it, just like we would look at building an airport or a road system. We wouldn't say, oh, well, we're going to build this road system, but we're only going to let poor people use it. We wouldn't say we're going to build this airport, but we're only going to let rich people use it. We're not going to say we're going to build this internet. You know, we need for everybody to have it. And it is the same with universal childcare. I think also it's important to start rethinking the way we think about this kind of resource for children. And to think of it not as sort of a service for women who ought to be at home doing what they're supposed to do anyway, but as a very important part of developing our human capital. We know a lot more now about the education possibilities for small children, and what if we do not provide equal education opportunities for them, even in early childhood development, we will be replicating inequality far into the future. So we need to make sure that's true. We also need to be sure that this is not done by the private sector, for example, because they will do it in a way that suits them, which means that it will be geographically and otherwise unequally distributed. And it will not be done for the convenience of women, but for the convenience of corporate offices and factories. So it's really important in order to ensure universal access, universal quality, and the female labor force participation across the entire female labor force, not just the rich and not just the poor. I think so that's the kind of thing I would say should be the kind of argument that should be put together. And it's easy enough, really, Pat, because the economic argument is really strong for childcare, really strong.
Thank you.
Carol?
Oh gosh, thank you so much, Linda, for sharing the statistics, may I say, that we really haven't seen before. You know, not just in the United States, but globally, to show us there is so far we have to go. So thank you for that. I will say I do have two questions, and maybe you can come back to me. The first one is Linda, you mentioned about the food security issue and how that particularly affects women, particularly women in poor areas. Now, I have looked at your book, but maybe you could share a little bit with the audience about how really horribly that constrains women, particularly in poverty situations with male dominance.
Right. On the ground level, if you will, the inequality of land ownership means that in order to be able literally to eat or have shelter over their heads, women have to be not only attached to a man, but in his good graces. And what we find is that very often women and female children, women and girls, are given less food. Food is withheld from them in order to punish them. And that this has long-term consequences for example, physical development of children, but also passing along things like birth defects, infant and maternal mortality. It's just extremely damaging. Where we intervene to equalize property ownership, we find that, for example, domestic violence goes down, and so does hunger among children. So it has a very positive effect. At the macro level, we've found that, in fact, that by we, I say the community of people who studies women's economic empowerment, that if we can equalize the playing field for women in agricultural production, which means not only land holding, but also provision of capital equipment, for example, provision of credit, that women can produce, they can go from producing about 15 to 20% less than men do agriculturally to producing equal amounts of food. All right, so what that means is that you're increasing the food supply by doing this, which in turn means that food security is more stable. And since food security, as you know, has massive implications for global peace or global strife, this should be in everyone's best interest. It's also the case that around the world, men are tending to leave the farms and go into the cities to work, and they are leaving behind women to manage farms who are suffering the same disadvantages that they suffer already. And that reduces then the production that we already have. And that it's called the feminization of agriculture, and it threatens the food supply for everybody on the planet. So this is something that really needs attention.
Thank you.
Hey, my goodness.
Can I go again?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, now switching gears. You talked about the influence of the Roberts Court in America. And we have had and been fighting for, and many of my colleagues have been fighting for, the Equal Rights Amendment. But it is not looking good. As you know, we've had setbacks in the judiciary, and it is stalled in the Senate. What do you think the impact would be of a defeat of the ERA on women's march towards equality? Can we recover if this, what would have been a great protection, and particularly in terms of course, pay and promotion in response to decisions like Duke versus Walmart, it's not going to be available to us for years, if ever.
Yeah, it's really discouraging. And as you mentioned before, you and I are contemporaries, so I remember that first fight. I'm still mad about it. So I would have really liked to have seen it go. But if we sort of say to ourselves, well, maybe symbolically this is one that we're not going to get this time around either. I don't know whether that's the tack to take. You guys are more politically savvy than I am on this. I do feel I feel very strongly that the employment situation is something that needs immediate attention. And I think much of the progress that women have made in the last 50 years has rested on their economic rights and on their reproductive rights. And these are both in jeopardy again, probably need some attention. One of the things that I suggest in the book I think is worth this group following up on, and that is changing the way that we enforce the equality laws in employment. And I refer to a study that was done by the European Commission on all the Western European countries and all the developed English-speaking countries, including the United States. And what they found across all of those economies is that they had enacted equality laws related to employment in the 1970s, and none of them had reached equal pay. And that the reason was pretty much the same, and that was that all of them left the enforcement up to individual women to bear the risk and the cost of suing their employers, and then left it possible for conservative forces, the judiciary in particular, simply to refuse to enforce the law. And this is basically what we've seen in the US, particularly since the 1990s. And the recommendation that that the European Union made was, or the European Commission made, was that that really, since it was the government simply had not had the will to enforce these laws, that it should be taken out of the hands of the judiciary entirely and put into a separate enforcement mechanism similar, for example, to the IRS. And then monitored on an ongoing basis, reports required and fines levied to everyone who violated, and not just the ones that women brought suits against. And I think this is the kind of thing we need to think about doing.
Thank you. I like that idea. we will get back to you on that one, Linda. Okay.
Are we all taking notes, everyone? I hope we're taking notes.
I hope so too.
Linda, I would like to ask you a question that relates specifically to the over 10,000 members of my caucus. The work of our Global Women's Caucus runs the gamut, really, of women's issues, and it includes violence against women and reproductive justice and climate action and so on. But how fundamental do you think this issue of economic well-being is in making progress on all these other issues that are keeping women down, that we're working on? Is this really the key to solving all our problems? And is this where we should start? And follow up to that, if there was one place, one thing that needs fixing first, where do you think we should focus our laser focus activism on to get it started? Can you identify a single root problem that we should tackle first?
Sure. Okay, so let me say, first of all, one of the points of writing the book was to demonstrate for women how important economic liberty was to women, and how crucial exclusion from economic life, the burdens of economic exclusion, have been to women in history. There are parts of this book that I think are really shocking as far as that goes. That it is just as important for women to have economic liberty as it is for them to have legal liberty, and that these things go together, and that including reproductive rights and safety. If I can give you an example from literature and popular culture, maybe a lot of the people who are watching this will be familiar with The Handmaid's Tale. And I will call your attention to the fact that the first act of the administration in The Handmaid's Tale was to take the women's economic rights away. It was to push them out of a job and take over their bank accounts and their investments and the credit. And that happens in like the first few pages of the book and the first like 10 minutes of the TV series. Once the economic power was taken away, those women had no recourse, and they discuss this in the TV series, they had no recourse but to turn to their men for support. Okay, they had to act through their men, was the only way to do it. And because they had no way of acting on their own behalf. They had no way of escaping, they had nothing. And we now see this all over the world. I've seen it in places where women are still virtually totally economically excluded. And obviously in The Handmaid's Tale, the administration then can take over their legal rights, their human rights, and their reproductive rights. And so I would just say that's a real good example. And that exact thing has happened many times in human history, and we should not let it happen again. So that would be my first thing. Now, if I were going to concentrate on the single one thing to do, I would have to ask myself, all right, am I looking at the thing that can be done with the most impact and the fastest, with the least effort, or what is the most important and far-reaching? So let me give you two, if I may, a little cheat on that. The fastest thing is to get rid of forced arbitration contracts. This is something that can be done through an act of Congress. They have already acted to exclude sexual harassment from these contracts. It is within their power to simply make them illegal altogether. There is bipartisan support for this. It is something that could be done very quickly. It already affects about half of American workers because it affects all workers, including minorities, but also including white males. It's just that women have more points of exposure that require this kind of remedy. And so that's what I think makes it a women's issue. So that would be the fastest thing, the lowest hanging fruit. The most important one, though, I will just say it until I probably go in the grave, that the most important thing is childcare, 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 and childcare. This is something that really should be a focal point. And once again, I can't emphasize enough that it does not matter whether you actually have children yourself. The whole issue of childcare is used to discriminate against women across the whole economy, and it needs to be taken care of.
Okay, well, we're writing it all down. So we'll take care of everything
Okay.
at once. Angela, do you have questions for the
Hi.
professor?
Yes, we have a lot of great questions in the Q&A box and one question on Facebook. Let's start with Betty Beeler. Her question is, many of your excellent ideas are viewed by a significant proportion of Americans as belonging to socialism, which has been distorted. How can we address this ideological misunderstanding?
Yes, I think socialism's meaning has been distorted by both the left and the right, frankly, in American politics, and it's too bad in many ways. I make it very clear in the book that I'm not a fan of socialism. I'm also not a fan of capitalism, and I also think that the women's situation is transcendent of both. It's certainly older than both. Patriarchal economics has been the way of human society for as long as we have any knowledge. So I don't really see it as one way or another. Still, the fact remains that you are absolutely right, Angela, that one of the big problems will be that it will be perceived as socialism, and that is a very bad word in American politics. My guess is that one way of handling this would be to emphasize the benefits to capitalism. The economic benefits of women's economic empowerment are well documented and overwhelming. It would be very hard for anybody, I think, that has any economic sophistication whatsoever to argue with the idea that for a capitalist economy, it's best to include the women as equally and fully as possible. So I guess that's what I would argue is the way to handle that. It's a good capitalist strategy. If you don't like capitalism, I'm sympathetic, but it's true.
We have another question from someone who's anonymous. The economic arguments that you laid out are so clear and obviously beneficial for all. How can we change our elected officials' thinking about women's economy?
Before I answer that, let me say that I kept referring to Angela in the answer to that question. I know it was Betty who asked it, so I do want to apologize to Betty. So yeah, this is a good question. I mean, when I watch the evening news, I'm sitting there going, how do we get to these people? Because they just are unaccustomed to thinking of women in truly economic terms. I think they're in a rut where they think that the only thing they need to look at is equal pay. I think they're in a rut, something that is actually a cheap kind of a cop-out to them, I think, when they think the only thing they need to say is that I'm on the side of pro-choice. We certainly expect them to be on the side of pro-choice, but that's a fairly easy argument for them to make, given that it's not up to them. And whereas the economic stuff is up to them. And they would have to take action, and they would have to stick their neck out, and they would have to get smarter than they are. But I think women are more than half the voters, and they're more than half of the economy, and other interest groups exact a price for their electoral support, and I think women need to learn to do the same.
Yes. I have a question that I'm not I'm not sure that it's valid or not. It's from Facebook. Um, it was the question popped up when you were talking about women's pay and their economics. So the question is, how does child support factor into that, and how much of men's advantage ends up in women's budgets?
I'm not sure I completely understand the question. How does child support end up
I
accounting for
think I
anything?
think in women's purchasing power.
Okay, women do have disproportionate purchasing power in the economy, and this occurs for two reasons. One is that they have command over income other than their own earned income. Okay, so for example, within a household, they have some command over the man's income as well as the woman's income. The other thing is that purchase decisions are thrown to them, for example, to buy things for children, right? And so that they control a disproportionate amount, even though they would have disproportionately less earning power, right, across the whole society. They nevertheless exert more purchasing power. I'm not entirely sure about how child support figures into this, other than to say that, child support infamously does not cover the cost of raising children. And I can say for myself, having raised two on my own, that it just doesn't begin to cover it. So I find it hard to accept the notion that somehow equalizes things.
Yes.
Or that is sufficient to take care of children's needs, taking care of children's needs is something that every government needs to pay better attention to.
Yes. Anne, do we have time for another question?
Yes, let's do one more question. Okay, one or two. One or two,
Oh,
if it's quick.
okay. This is from Sarah Jane Leone. She says, "I'm a part of the global UN family as previously an employee in East Africa, but now I'm following my husband, and there is a serious gender parity initiative mandated by
Okay.
mandated
Sorry.
mandated by
Sorry,
Gucci.
I did turn that phone off. I don't know what the problem was there.
Yeah, okay. Here we go. There's a serious gender parity initiative mandated by Gutierrez across all levels that appears to be achieving its goal. Biden has appointed the most inclusive cabinet in history, but this recent inclusiveness is not a salve for the entrenched sexism. Should the U.S. government mandate gender parity within its federal agencies? Is this a plausible goal? And if so, what can we do as voters to bring it about?
So it's a good question. In general, my position is that we need to be more concerned about whether or not our leaders are sympathetic to women than that they are women. Okay, and I think that I, anyway, work with a lot of sympathetic men who are very effective, and I would hate for them to be shoved out of posts because they were male. On the other hand, I think it is reasonable to expect that as the number of women in posts that are leadership posts or that have policy impact, as the number of women increase, the probability that policy would become not only more gender friendly, but generally more long-term focus and equitable. One of the points of the Double X economy, the book, is that women do have a different way of managing money than men, and that it is very different from the kind of rape and pillage economy that we have running the world philosophy now. So that I do think that most likely it would have a beneficial effect. I personally think that the tactics that have been taken since 2016, where we're encouraging more women to run for office, more women to join the government, more women to join in campaigns, has so far had a salutary effect, and that would be something we should continue.
All right.
Okay. It looks like, do you have another one, or shall I throw out the last question?
You go ahead and read the last question.
Okay. Well, this one, of course, is another one about our activism. You really do have a captive audience of American activists listening in from around the world today. Can you tell us how we can support you and your important work best from our far-flung locations around the world? Do you have a special call for action, or perhaps one final thought that you would like to share with us?
The book does actually, it's I think unusual for feminist texts, has an epilogue that is next steps, and it is literally try this, try this, try this, try this. So and I do bill it as just a start. My hope is that if people read and listen to me, that they will come up with their own ideas. I think once you understand the interactions of all of these constraints, it becomes much easier to see, oh, I could intervene here and here, right? And that everybody has some way they can do it. It may just be by, for example, that gender inequality causes poverty, peace for USAID. If everybody would go to their site and send that out over their social media, it would make a huge difference for the gender group within USAID, for instance. There's a group called Women for Women International that focuses only on women in conflict areas, and not many charities even go there. So sending a check for $25 to them would help. So lots of different things like that. But like I said, there's a laundry list to get people started at the end of the book.
Oh, that's wonderful. You've given us a checklist. I love checklists. Good. Okay, so everybody get the book and look at what we're supposed to do next. All right. Well, thank you again, Professor Scott. Thank you so much. And thanks to everyone of you who joined us today on this call. I hope you've enjoyed the discussion as much as I have. I certainly have learned a lot today, and now I know I'm going to go out and do some action points too. Well, Democrats are working on many fronts to advance gender equality in the states, and Pat and Carol's Women's Economic Wellbeing team will be promoting activism in the coming months aimed at encouraging Congress and the administration to remove the barriers described by Professor Scott for the benefit of us all. So watch out for those calls to action. And speaking of action, our GWC Climate Action Team will be leading a guided discussion on forests and climate on April 21st at noon Eastern as part of their Earth Day Week of Action. If you haven't signed up for it yet, or you can follow the link that Angela will put in the chat box and find out more about this and other Women's Caucus events. We'd love to see you there. And in closing, I'd like to give a big shout out to all of our great volunteers, and let everyone on the call know that Carol and Pat and all of our teams would love to have your help. So please consider stepping up as a volunteer. Our link will be in the chat box. But for now, we'll say goodbye and close the call, and we'll all go check on our to-do list and what we do next. So thank you so much for joining us on this call, and we hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you so much, Professor Scott. We will keep in touch. Okay.
I would love to be in touch with you and your group. This is awesome.
We'll let you know what develops out of this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good luck with your work.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. Thanks for coming. And you can check out Professor Scott's book or volunteer, or check out our Earth Day events at the links in the chat. I'm ending the live stream.